Welcome back to Stu Structures. We're here to look at using natural materials for scenery detail, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Stu Structures. We're here to take a slightly different path this week. I go through nature all the time, and I just have this way of looking at things to see, well, can that be used as a scenery material? And I look at a lot of different things, and years ago I used a bunch of mosses and various things in a couple of modules I did for a group that I was modeling with. But I'm just going to take some time here, and we're going to take a walk in the woods and look at some different materials that I can find in the nursery and various things that, if you look hard enough, you can find things like this too. It can save you a lot of money in scenery details for doing your scenery on your model layout. So let's just jump into this and take a walk in the woods. When you're modeling scenery, the best thing to do is to get pictures and stuff of the area that you're actually modeling and kind of try to duplicate what you see in nature. And sometimes you just have to take a step back from everything like you see in these shots here and just, look at the forms of the types of trees that are in the area you're modeling. Nothing's really regular. Everything is very irregular in trees and plants, and there's just, there's no two alike. So, there's nothing you could make that's that weird that you won't find in nature. And the other thing besides the treetops is, where they meet the ground and all the undergrowth, the laying down branches, the weeds, the different textures and colors and stuff. This is a fall scene, so it varies from the time of year depending on what you're wanting to model. But, duplicating nature it's involved because there's not one single type of a plant in any of these pictures that you see in the undergrowth and the understory trees or the big trees. There's just 10,000 different forms of life in all these pictures. So the more various types of materials that you can use when you're building your scenery, the more lifelike it's going to look. And I did wait till fall to kind of film some of these because a lot of the leaves have dropped and opened it up to where you can really see the tree canopy and, a lot of the things around. But, it's just a whole lot of stuff, and you just need to take a step back from it and really look to see what's there. Now, to duplicate this, I find a lot of stuff in nature, but I do find stuff in my nursery. And these are just some spireas, and it's not the easiest to see. I'll show you some better examples, but I just go through and look for pieces like this of the tops that can be pruned a little bit to mimic a good top on a tree. And some of these are great just off the plant as they are, but a lot of them have really, really nice forms. I mean, this would be really big for HO, but trees can grow 120, 130, 40 feet. Not all of them are. A lot of them are 50, 60 feet. And in HO, that's pretty tall. Most trees that you find that are made for the hobby are actually a little too small unless they're in your yard or an understory tree. But here you can see some of those tops dried from the spirea. And there's just a lot of nice basic structures for trees. And when you're gathering stuff out of the wild like this, there's no two the same. They're all different. And you may want to prune and work with some of these before you start adding foliage. And there are some that have bigger crowns, like these here are awesome. One of the next plants I'm going to go to is a stilbe. Now this is a perennial which dies to the ground every year, and when I picked these they were just a little green. Now, they have a beautiful structure to them for trees. I would probably add some foliage, and as they dry, they start to lose all this leafy material, so I would probably treat them with a white glue water mixture or something that would soak into the plant, and it would adhere all this stuff so it doesn't fall off, as it gets old and brittle, which most plants do. Now here's another perennial, Liatris. I mean, as it's, as the plant grows, the whole plant isn't good for a tree, but, after these have dried and I've taken off all the foliage, they're great for dead trees, like laying, falling down, laying in the woods, or leaning against another tree. Another plant that I like is, ornamental grasses, fountain grass, pampas grass, things like that. Because after you remove all the seed heads from all these stalks, they really mimic, certain types of plants that grow in the wild with short stems. Now, some of these could be used for ornamental, small, thin, narrow trees. Or you can break the pieces on down and use them as individual little plant stalks. And it's just a different form of plant that you can use in your mix when you go putting stuff in your scenery for detail. And you don't want to overdo any one thing, but a few of these here and there, and look at these. These are almost like dead corn stalks if you were planting a fall scene with some corn rows or something, but just another nice thing to use. Now everybody is familiar with sedums, and this is another perennial that grows, and the tops, once they're dried, they form a nice real high canopy tree. Now these don't mimic a lot of the trees that you find in the United States. You see these more in the high desert in like Africa or South America. But in the background, as far as setting up a canopy of trees in the background, they're great, because once you put foliage onto these, they make a nice canopy for taller trees. Now, as far as small trees in a yard, this is not, really the finest example, but you could use them anywhere on the layout, but they make nice background trees in a large forested canopy. And it's just, another plant out in nature that's great to use for this type of example. And just walking through the woods, I found several things that you could find to use. I mean, these are seed pods off of a fern from this year. And the little pods could be broken off. Another thing, walking around the nursery, I just noticed all these needled evergreens, and these aren't great to do a lot of, but if you put one or two here or there in a scene so they're not real obvious, they would add a different texture, and you could add little foliage to these, or to give them a different texture or different appeal. But cutting little tiny tips of the branches off of these just make something else to add into the mix when you're doing all your native plantings in your scenery. And then we get into mosses. There are so many different mosses. And a lot of these come up really thick and heavy, so you got to watch how you use them in putting down your scenery material. Or some of these you could just take little tiny tip growth off of them and use them. And a lot of these do fall apart pretty readily when you're using them in your landscape or and your scenery. So it's good to go ahead and use a white glue mixture or something on these, and maybe even paint them a little just before you put them on there, so they aren't falling to dust as time goes on your model railroad. But there's just an infinite variety of mosses. I have used some of these just in sheets. Some of this, like this one here, would mimic grass really nicely, and tufts if you broke it up, and would give you another texture to use on your railroad. And through the year, some of these forms change a little bit. You might look at one moss in the springtime and then look again at it in the fall, and the texture of the moss would be totally different because of its growth habit over a year. So take different walks through the woods at different times of the year and see what the changes are, and see how they would be usable, on your layout. There's a lot of these that, just as an individual part of the 20 things you might use as little pieces to make up a small, woodland scene or something, they just add a different texture, a different color, and, so they would create depth in your railroad. So, Mussels are just another thing to go out into the woods and collect for your model railroad. There's just so many of them. You know, I mean, all these, there's a lot of different varieties besides the pictures that I'm showing you. I live in the Mideastern United States, so they change. And here's just an unexpected find. This is not out of nature, but I happen to be cutting a big blue plastic 55-gallon drum apart with a saw one time. And you know, when I got done cutting the panels, I used this real aggressive saw blade. And you know, it works better on a real hot day when the plastic's really soft, but every time I cut one of these panels apart, the edges where I cut them would just form these really nice, what look like, you know, plant rows, which could be used in like a home garden or something. They're definitely really thin, narrow rows, but the edge that I break off of this once I cut it are just like little rows of plants. So, you know, this is just an unexpected find. I had some blue from that thicker thing that I cut that actually were better. So there you have a look at some things out of nature that you could use on your model railroad. You know, when you look around and pan shots of woods and landscape under the woods and yards and gardens and all that type of thing, you know, there are just tons of various shapes, colors, textures and things like that, and a lot of that can be replicated with things that you do find in the woods. Just, you know, some of the various things I showed you here that can be worked with, and you know, will work on your model layout. You know, I mean, even some of the things you're starting to find in, you know, super trees and various things like that come from plants in the real world. They're not all manufactured and put out here. So anyway, you know, I like to save money where I can, and a lot of these scenery materials, like I said earlier in the video, I used years ago when we used to build modules and do shows for a group that I belonged to years ago. But, you know, a lot of things have to be processed. They get dry and brittle or this or that. There's ways of overcoming all those issues. Some of those I went over in this video. And, you know, a lot of it's trial and error. Some things will work for you, some won't. I mean, a lot of things have worked for me, and there are those that have not. Sometimes I try them anyway, just to kind of get an idea, and you know, it's very rarely do I ever just rip something out because it just didn't work right. Usually by adding layers of texture and color and various things in the scenery, you know, you can come to an end result that looks good. It's really the layers that do make things, you know. Even when you make a tree, you know, not just using one solid color of phlox or, you know, leaves or whatever you're putting on your trees for foliage, but doing a few different colors. Usually the tops of the trees that are more sun exposed are a more brilliant color than the underneath of the tree, which is usually a darker color. And when you look at what's laying in the woods, you know, you could use 40 different things underneath trees and not be overdoing it for scenery underneath of trees. You know, a lot of times underneath the trees don't show, but in the wood line and the edge of the woods and that particular area, you know, there's briars, there's logs laying down, there's leaves on the ground, there's mosses growing, there's just tons and tons and tons of different types of plants and things growing. So just to put down a phlox underneath everything as a green material or a bunch of leaves, you know, you really need to layer in a lot of different types of materials and effect to make it look more realistic. And in gardens and things like that, you know, there's not all the same plant in a whole garden. There's a bunch of different types of plants. So there again, you're looking for different size foliage, different color foliage, different stem structures, you know, different ground covers underneath of them, different colors and textures of all that stuff. And the more you do that, the more realistic it is. So I like just using as much of this out of nature as I can and supplementing that with a lot of stuff too that is commercially available. And I find that I get better results in doing that, and just things look more realistic to me when it's all said and done. So anyway, thank you for coming back and sharing this time with me. I do appreciate it. I hope this has helped you and, giving you some other ideas to experiment with things. That's just what it's all about. Sometimes just by playing with things, you can come up with things that, you haven't seen before or tried before that really look pretty good in the long process. So jump out there and experiment a little bit. Take a walk in the woods and see what kind of materials you can find to play with in your model railroad. There's tons of stuff out there. You'll never run out of different examples and things to use. I just happen to be lucky to have a nursery to grab some stuff out of, my nursery as well. But, all that stuff's available in your yard, in the woods, anywhere you go, the beach, anywhere. There's different materials and aggregates and various things to use. So jump out there and experiment and enjoy doing some scenery on your model layout. Like and share this material. It helps my analytics and gets me out there to more people. A lot of people out there, are looking for clues on how to do a lot of different things in their model layout. So, share this with other people in the hobby. And thank you for coming back and sharing this time with me. I do appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's a little different than my typical thing that I'm throwing out there. But I've been working on this for a while and just needed a good filler video. So I'm throwing this out there. I hope you've enjoyed it. And drag out your trains and play. Wintertime's coming. Do some happy model railroading.